Hello again. We're halfway through our 7 Layers of Security mini-series on Grey Matter Talks Tech, and today we're going to dive into application security. For IT admins out there, patching can really seem like a boring bit of IT maintenance, and it's tasks that nobody really wants to think about. But here's the reality. Some of the biggest, most devastating breaches in history happened because organizations failed to apply available patches. Equifax, WannaCry, NotPetya, all examples of billions of dollars and pounds worth of damages. Millions of people affected, all because known vulnerabilities were not patched. In the current state, in 2025, your applications depend on a complex ecosystem of software. You've got your operating systems, you've got your business applications, and you've got third-party library plugins, frameworks and dependencies. Each one of these components can have vulnerabilities, and attackers are constantly scanning for them. But what is application security? As always, we start with the fundamentals. When we say patching and vulnerability management and application security, starting with vulnerabilities, it's a weakness or a flaw in software, hardware configurations that could be easily exploited by an attacker to compromise security. Think of it like a crack in your armor. Vulnerabilities can come in many different forms. Coding errors might allow buffer overflows where attackers can inject malicious code. Logic flaws might let users bypass authentication or access data that they really shouldn't be seeing. Misconfigurations might leave services exposed with default credentials. Design weaknesses might use outdated cryptography that can be broken. Vulnerabilities exist everywhere in your operating system, whether it's Windows, Linux, macOS, in your applications, Microsoft Adobe, Office, web browsers, or in third-party components, libraries, frameworks, plugins. Your developers might use these to build applications. In web applications, APIs, the custom software that your organization builds or buys. Looking into patching, a patch is a piece of software designed to fix vulnerabilities, any bugs, or improve functionality. It's essentially an update that modifies the existing software to correct problems. Patches come in various forms. They specifically address vulnerabilities that could be exploited. A hotfix is an urgent patch that is released outside of a normal schedule to address any critical issues. Service packs or cumulative updates bundles are multiple patches bundled together. Feature updates may include security improvements along with any new functionality. Looking into patching even further, patching is processing or applying these updates to your systems and applications. Sounds simple, right? Install the update, problem solved. But in practice, it's a far more complex environment, especially in a large organization with hundreds or maybe thousands of devices to look after, and 24/7 business operations where downtime can be really costly. Vulnerability management is the broader outgoing process or ongoing process of identifying, evaluating, prioritizing and remediating vulnerabilities across your entire environment. It's not just about applying patches. It's a comprehensive program that needs discovery and inventory. You need to know your assets, and before you can even think about it, that's more important than anything in the world. What devices, what operating systems, what applications, what version are you on? You can't patch what you don't know exists. Vulnerability scanning, using automated tools to regularly scan your environment and identify known issues, are very valuable. These scanners will compare your systems against a database of known issues and known vulnerabilities to find those weaknesses. Assess and prioritize. Not all vulnerabilities are equally dangerous. Some are actually critical and actively being exploited in the wild. Others are low risk or just theoretical. You need to prioritize based on the severity, exploitability, and what impact the business might have by not taking care of them. Remediation, that actually means just fixing the vulnerabilities. Usually means applying more patches, but might also include configuration changes, implementing controls, or even decommissioning a vulnerable system that can't be patched if it's either end of service, end of support, or end of life as a product. Verification and actually confirming that the remediation has worked and been effective and the vulnerability has been closed. Pairing that with reporting and metrics, track the progress, identify any trends that are coming up in the business, and demonstrating compliance with any security policies and any regulations that you have to meet. Let's talk about two of the most and major specific areas: operating systems and patching third-party applications. Operating system patching does involve keeping Windows, Linux, Mac, even mobile systems now up to date. Microsoft tend to release patches on something called Patch Tuesday, the second Tuesday of each month. Any releases for Apple, iOS and macOS are much more regular, and Linux distributions have their own update mechanisms. Operating system patches are foundationally beneficial because the operating system underlies everything else. A vulnerability in Windows affects every application running on a Windows machine. An iOS vulnerability affects every app that might be on an iPhone. Third-party application patching is quite challenging, and because you're dealing with software from hundreds or thousands of different vendors, each with their own update mechanisms and schedules, and it makes you think about all the applications in your environment. For example, things like Adobe Reader, Java, web browsers, Chrome and Firefox, productivity software like M365, specialist business application in databases like MySQL or PostgreSQL, web servers like Apache or Nginx content management systems like WordPress, and countless other libraries and frameworks. Many of the worst breaches have involved third-party components. An Equifax breach is a great example of an exploited vulnerability that was in Apache Struts. That's a web application framework. The SolarWinds compromise supply chain attack affected third-party software that organizations trusted and had deeply embedded within their infrastructure. The challenge with third-party software is visibility. Your developers might often include dozens of open source libraries in an application. And without documenting them, shadow IT departments might deploy applications without a main IT department's knowledge. Mobile devices also have apps that might be installed that IT never approved. And more complexity. Lots of dependencies. Your application uses library A, which might depend on library B, which depends on library C. If library C has a vulnerability, your application is vulnerable, even though you didn't directly choose library C and might not even know that it's there. This is where tools like software composition analysis, or SCA, come into effect, helping you identify all the components in your applications, including these hidden dependencies, and alerting you when vulnerabilities are discovered in any form. To summarize, vulnerabilities are weaknesses the attackers can exploit, and patches are fixes for those vulnerabilities. Patching is applying those, and vulnerability management is the comprehensive, ongoing process of finding and fixing vulnerabilities across your entire technology stack, including operating systems and the ever-complex web of third-party applications and components that modern organizations depend on. But why do you need it? And what are the risks if you don't have an effective patching and vulnerability management policy? Well, we need to understand vulnerabilities in the first place. When a vulnerability is discovered and publicly disclosed, it's typically assigned something called a CVE. MITRE framework, for example, and that website, great one to look at. Also known as Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures, CVE, such as CVE 2025 12345. It will always have a number assigned. It'll provide you details about the vulnerability, it'll get published, including, and often, what systems are affected, and sometimes even a proof of concept exploit code. So you can go and investigate if it's in anything else or anything else you've used, say, open source code for. This does create a race. Defenders will need to patch their system before attackers can exploit the vulnerability. And here's the thing. Attackers have industrialized this process. Automated scanning tools constantly probe the internet looking for vulnerable system. Within hours, days of a vulnerability being disclosed, you'll see widespread exploitation attempts, and the window between disclosure and the exploitation is shrinking. Sometimes it's measured in weeks, sometimes days, sometimes hours, and in some cases, attackers discover vulnerabilities even before the vendors do, and they call that a zero-day vulnerability, and exploit them before patches can even exist. There are some great examples, or I'll use the word more sobering examples, of what happens when patching fails. We've already referred to the Equifax breach in 2017 in an earlier podcast, and it was that Apache Struts vulnerability. It's a very popular web application framework, and it was disclosed in March that year. A patch was available immediately. However, Equifax didn't apply that patch to all their systems, and in May, the attackers exploited that exact vulnerability and stole the personal information of 147 million people. More surprisingly, the company knew about the vulnerability. They had the patch, but they still got breached. The cost, over $1.4 billion in breach-related expenses. Another effect of that, massive reputational damage, and the CEO actually had to resign. Again, we've talked about WannaCry in an earlier podcast. We're going back to it again. It was a Windows vulnerability that caused this. Microsoft had actually patched it 2 months earlier, but the organizations that were using this and hadn't applied it were devastated. The ransomware spread globally and affected over 200,000 computers in across 150 countries. The UK NHS service was absolutely crippled, with hospitals unable to access patient records and having to turn away patients. Manufacturing plants shut down, and the estimated global cost was billions of dollars, all preventable if organizations had patched their Windows systems. Again, we've referenced NotPetya in 2017, just after WannaCry, and used very similar vulnerabilities. It masqueraded as ransomware, but was actually a very destructive malware that permanently destroyed data. It caused massive disruption to global shipping, pharmaceutical companies, and other businesses. Maersk, the world's largest shipping company, had to reinstall 4,000 servers and 45,000 PCs. FedEx's TNT Express division lost $300 million. Again, the vulnerabilities were known and patched, but many organizations hadn't deployed these patches. So, again, what are the risks of not patching? Well, data breaches are the most obvious risk. Attackers exploit vulnerabilities to gain access. They'll steal customer data, your intellectual property, financial records, even personal information. The costs may include regulatory fines from the UK side, the ICO, lawsuits, notification expenses, credit monitoring for affected individuals, and reputational damage. Ransomware does often enter through unpatched vulnerabilities. Attackers will encrypt your data and demand payment for the decryption key, even if you pay, which I advise completely against. There's no guarantee that you'll get your data back. The downtime alone has destroyed businesses. There was a recent example of a haulage firm that existed for nearly 50 years that closed down completely because of ransomware. They never fully recover. System compromise and persistent access happens when attackers exploit vulnerabilities. They'll establish backdoors, and they might try to go undetected and stay there for months, slowly stealing data, monitoring communications, or preparing for a larger attack. Added to this, regulatory and compliance failures are significant. We've already covered some of those in earlier podcasts, but a lot of them require organizations to maintain security controls, and that includes timely patching. Such failures can result in massive fines. GDPR fines can reach up to 4% of a company's annual revenue. Business disruption occurs when exploitation of vulnerabilities causes systems to crash. Malware will spread, or networks to be taken offline, and they need instant response and recovery. The costs include lost revenue, productivity losses, overtime for staff remediation, or damage to customer relationship. If we talk about third-party, specifically operating system risks, operating system vulnerabilities are really dangerous because they're foundational. A privileged escalation vulnerability in Windows could let an attacker who compromises a regular user account to gain administration rights. Something called a remote code execution vulnerability could let hackers take complete control of the system or the network without any user interaction whatsoever. Microsoft, Apple, and Linux communities are constantly finding and patching operating system vulnerabilities. Microsoft alone patches dozens to hundreds of vulnerabilities every month. If you're not keeping up, you're falling behind, and the attackers know it. Third-party application vulnerabilities present unique challenges. Many organizations focus heavily on patching operating systems, but they neglect the third party, and that's a dangerous blind spot. Because most of these applications are widely deployed and frequently handle untrusted content, for instance, a malicious PDF can exploit a vulnerability in Adobe Reader, or a compromised website can exploit a browser vulnerability. A malicious Java applet can compromise your system. Supply chain risks continue to be and are an emerging concern. When you use third-party software, you're trusting that vendor security. The SolarWinds attack we referred to demonstrated this dramatically. They compromised the software build process and inserted malicious code into legitimate updates. Organizations installed what they thought was a security update. It was actually malware. Open source component risks are also underestimated. Developers do love a bit of open source library because they speed up development, but organizations have poor visibility into what open source components they're using. Again, a very well-known is the Log4j shell vulnerability. Widely used in the Log4j logging library, it discovered organizations and they were scrambling to figure out even if they're affected, which is very difficult. The bottom line is, every day you delay patching is a day that you're vulnerable. Attackers have the tools, the motivation, and the knowledge to find and exploit unpatched systems. The question isn't if you'll be targeted, but when, and whether you'll be protected for when that happens. Effective patching and vulnerability management isn't optional. It's the fundamental hygiene that makes everything else possible. It's like saying, why do I need to lock my doors? Sure, locks aren't perfect, but leaving your doors unlocked is asking for trouble. To give you some examples of what you can implement to have a good patching and vulnerability strategy, establish an asset inventory. You can't patch what you don't know exists. And it is the first step to building and maintaining a complete inventory of everything. Use asset discovery tools that automatically scan your network and identify devices and operating systems and installed applications. Tools, for instance, that we provide, such as Microsoft Endpoint Configuration or Manage Engine, can really help you with this visibility. And if you're pushed for budget and have a small team, there are open source solutions like Nmap and OpenVAS that can help you. Second example, regular vulnerability scanning. Once you know what you have, scan it regularly to identify vulnerabilities. Implement authenticated scanning where possible. This means the scanner logs onto systems with the right credentials appropriate, and they get a complete view of installed software and any configurations. Unauthenticated scans can only see what's externally visible, and they will miss many vulnerabilities. Critical production systems might be scanned weekly or even daily. Less critical systems might be monthly. The key is consistency and coverage. Use multiple tools for comprehensive coverage. Network vulnerability scanners and platforms like AppCheck identify vulnerabilities in operating systems, applications, and network devices. Web applications like Burp Suite, OWASP, Zap, or Akinetics find vulnerabilities in things like web applications. We're seeing a move to more containerized environments in things like Azure and AWS, and container scanning tools check Docker images and Kubernetes deployments for any vulnerable components. Infrastructure as a code scanning analysis in things like Terraform or CloudFormation templates for security misconfigurations before they get deployed are really a priority. Example 3, prioritizing vulnerabilities with a risk-based approach. You've scanned and found 10,000 vulnerabilities. Now what? You can't patch everything immediately, so you need to prioritize. That's where the CVE, or Common Vulnerability Scoring System, CVSS, is a great starting point. CVSS scores range from 0 to 10, with 9 to 10 being very critical, 7 to 8.9 is crisis high, 4.0 to 6.9 is the medium risk, and 0.1 to 3.9 is low. But don't solely rely on CVSS scores. Add business context. Asset criticality and a high severity vulnerability at the 10 on your public-facing e-commerce server is more urgent than the same vulnerability on a test server in an isolated lab. Exploitability. Is the vulnerability actively being exploited in the wild? Is exploit code publicly available? And use the CISA Known Exploited Vulnerabilities catalog that will list vulnerabilities that are actively being exploited. Exposure. Is the vulnerable system exposed to the internet, or do people only access it internally? Internet-facing systems are the higher priority. Compensating the controls. Do you have other security measures that might mitigate the risk? A vulnerable web server behind a web application firewall that's configured to block the exploit might be a lower priority than an unprotected system. If you're in a larger organization, you might want to create a priority matrix. For example, P1 will be classed as critical. That needs patching within 24 to 48 hours. They are critical vulnerabilities on an internet-facing system, or they're actively exploiting vulnerabilities. P2 will be classed as high. They need to be patched within 7 days. High severity vulnerabilities on critical internal systems. P3, medium. Patched within 30 days. Medium vulnerabilities or high vulnerabilities on less critical systems. P4, low. Patch at the next maintenance window. Low severity vulnerabilities or those with very strong compensating controls. In another example, you could go as far as creating an emergency patching process. Not all vulnerabilities can wait for your normal patching cycle. Sometimes you need an emergency process. Let's say a critical 0-day vulnerability is disclosed that's actively being exploited. Your emergency process might look like hour 0 to 2. Your security team assesses the vulnerability. Is it applicable to your environment? What systems are affected? What's the risk? Hour 2 to 4. Rapid testing of the patch on a sandbox test environment. If no patch exists yet, implement workarounds or compensating controls that have been recommended by the vendor or third party that's got the problem. Hour 4 to 8. Emergency deployment to internet-facing systems and other high-risk assets. Day 1 to 3. Continued deployment to remaining systems on an accelerated schedule. Document this emergency process in advance so everyone knows their roles. They have an emergency change approval process that can be activated quickly. In conclusion, effective vulnerability management, it requires visibility into your assets, regular scanning to identify vulnerabilities, intelligent prioritization based on risk, and timely patching of both. You need operating systems and third applications to be included in this, and continuous measurement and improvement. Start with the basics. Build the inventory, implement change, prioritize critical vulnerabilities, and establish a consistent patching cadence. Then look at maturing the program with things like automation and integration into development pipelines and advanced analytics. Remember, every unpatched vulnerability is an open door. Every patch you apply closes that door, but the attackers are always looking to open those every single day. Make sure your doors are closed. And that brings us to the end of today's episode. If you'd like to book a meeting to discuss app security in more detail, please email info@greymatter.com. Subscribe now so you don't miss out on all future episodes covering the rest of the layers and the conversations with security experts on trends and best practices.